it's so nice to be back with you all. I am sorry to have missed the first Fridays last month where you got to meet all of the coaches from McPherson College and play some athletics Jeopardy. But I'm really very glad to be back with you this month. And so in a few minutes, we are looking forward to hearing from Dr. James Bowyer. And he has given himself the small task of sharing with you about choral music for 1,000 years in 60 minutes, in under 60 minutes. So hold on to your hats. And if you're not wearing hats, you may want to hold on to your seats because this is going to be a quick introduction to the history of choral music. But before I turn it over to him, I have just a few announcements to help you stay connected with what's happening at the college or take advantage of opportunities that are coming up. On Saturday, October the 6th, we have a very special treat. Boston Brass will be coming and playing a free concert at McPherson College as part of the Lingenfelder Artist Series. And Boston Brass travels the country and are well known as amazing musical performers. So that is a free concert. We will have had a First Friday just the day before it, but I want you to have it on your calendar and make sure to make plans to see Boston Brass. And if you are going to come, make sure to come early enough to get a good seat. The concert is free and it's open seating, but we do expect it to be popular. So that's a 7:30 concert, and we would invite you to come early enough that you feel comfortable to get good seating. Another reminder that it's not too early to sign up for homecoming, which is October the 20th, so a little over a month away, and we're looking forward to having everybody back for football game, for several different class reunions, and to visit and catch up with each other. The special celebrations at this homecoming are that the education majors or anybody that studied education at McPherson is going to have a reunion on Friday night. And then on Saturday evening before the play, there'll be a celebration of Rick Tyler, a bit of a retirement party, a little bit of a reunion for theater people, and that'll be at the President's house. So make sure to be at homecoming. And then, Rebecca, yes? That's what I was announcing. Yeah, it's a Saturday evening performance on Saturday, October the 6th at 7:30 in the evening. That's in Salina, but that's not for us. Yeah, ours is just an evening performance. So good. Thank you for asking about those, Rebecca. So next month, our first Friday will be Dr. Ken Yan, and so that will be on Friday, October the 5th. He is a professor of history at McPherson College, and his presentation is titled ISIS, Democracy, and Refugees, Civil War in Syria. And so if you listen to the news, if you watch the news, you know that this is a very timely topic. And so we will look forward to hearing from Ken about that. And now that the cookies are here, everyone can take a deep sigh of relief, and we can welcome James. Thank you so much for what you're going to share.
We had a few technical difficulties, so you're going to be hearing the music via my computer through this microphone. So let's see what happens on that.
You're not very loud.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm all wired today. Can you hear me now? Yeah. So today my presentation is called 1,000 Years of Choral Music in 60 Minutes. It's actually going to be more like 1,400 years of choral music because we're going all the way back to Gregorian chant. I hope by the end of it you're not so bored that it feels like you've been 1,000 years in your seat. I'm going to dive right in. And I'm a little intimidated because we have like an actual musician professor over here, so I'll do my best. So today we're going to discover and rediscover the development of choral music beginning in the Middle Ages with plain chant. Then we're going to, as we go along, listen to some excerpts of representative choral works. And then I hope that we have plenty of time for you to ask questions and make comments. The Middle Ages. The Middle Ages spans, of course, like 1,000 years. The music of the Catholic Church is what we call plain chant. It's monophonic, or every voice in unison. There's no harmony parts. And that sort of chant goes back into antiquity, the idea of groups singing all on the same tune. By the time we get to the fall of Rome and the beginnings of the Catholicism spreading across Europe, there needed to be a codified song repertoire. And so these chants were put together into books, and they were spread, and then there became a body of the first choral literature. And that's called plain chant. I'll just play a little bit of it. This is a plain chant called Pange Lingua Gloriosi. Can you hear it at all? Okay. Okay, so you heard that it was a unison singing in Latin. Latin, of course, is the language of the church. When Latin was the language of ancient Rome, it was retained in the church even into the 20th century. Next, this is a correlation, but perhaps a causation, as we moved away from architecture, Romanesque architecture, and moved into Gothic architecture, where the windows got larger, the flying buttresses on the church allowed those cathedral ceilings to rise tremendously high places, for instance, at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. That coincided with the development of two-part music. And what they would do is they would take something, the Gregorian chant, and they would add a second line to it, often parallel. And so this is called organum. And this began around the 9th century and moved into the 12th century. So this is the beginning of choral music, in that music started to develop into multi-part singing. Okay, so this is called organum. The organal voice is the melody. Here. So you can hear that it retained this chant-like quality. Chant is supposed to follow the flow of speech, and it really heightens speech. You know that when you hear a song with words, it's very different, and you feel much more invested in the text, and that's why we love to sing hymns in church. So when we started to add, when those plain chants began to be echoing all over in these large cathedrals, what would come back would be resonances from the overtone series, and those would be at the fifth and the octave. And so I think this became very pleasing to the ear, and so they simply just started having singers sing those second and then third and then fourth voices, and that's where we're moving toward the end of the Middle Ages. Ars Antiqua is the antiquated arts that was named after the fact, once the Ars Nova folks, the new arts, looked back the previous centuries and they decided it was old-fashioned. Both Ars Antiqua and Ars Nova are choral traditions centered in Paris, the Notre Dame Cathedral. So these organal voices that had been patterned on parallel motion now give way to the beginnings of multi-part singing, where both lines are doing different things. So this sounds like this. You're going to hear part that sounds like a chant, and then other parts that sound like they're doing completely different things. So you hear a chant line under, holding long notes, and then very busy, florid harmonies above it. This would have been very dramatic for the day. Then that became old-fashioned, and by the time we get to the end of the Middle Ages, we have this new art, and this comes from the composer. This music is really fundamentally the sound of the composer Machaut. And Machaut did a very interesting thing. He took these chants, because at the time you would have multiple choices of chants that you would sing at different parts of the Catholic service and at different times of the year and different times of the day. And so the 5 basic parts of every Mass, regardless of day or time, even on holidays, would be Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei. The Kyrie can be taken out, and there are parts that are actually flexible. But what he did was he was one of the first composers to actually conceive of the Mass, the entire church service, as a unified musical whole. So what he did was, from all of this music, because you could just choose any of the Pange linguas that you wanted. And so what he did was he was really the first composer to write a multi-work, a multi-movement choral work. And this is the beginning of when we start to hear choir music as, this sounds like a choir. And so this is the Kyrie, or the Lord Have Mercy movement, from his Mass that he wrote for the Notre Dame Cathedral. So now we're moving in harmonies. Can you hear that? Can you turn it up? A little bit better? Okay. So it's very different. Sorry if I'm screaming now. It's very different to our ears, but it really is the turning point in Western choral music. And to the music that you'll hear in the Renaissance really is music that you would be more typically hearing at like a choral concert. Secular music of the day went different directions. You've heard of troubadours. Troubadours and trouvères were secular music was really music for the courts, the kings, the dukes, and so forth. And there were 2 patrons of the arts all the way through the Middle Ages. Really, the church was funding music, and the king and queen, or the duke and duchess, or so those were the 2 major patrons of the arts, and each had different tastes, and each had different needs. So the music of the secular music is very different sounding than sacred. We don't have nearly as much secular music because these were traveling musicians in some cases, and so there wasn't codified written music. The troubadours were French traveling musicians. They were jugglers. They were acrobats. They sang, they did morality plays, they did all of this sort of entertainment, and they're sort of the beginning of secular music that we know of now from music history. The major body of choral music is in Latin because the people paying for the music were the churches that needed to provide music for their services. So now the secular music is going to be in the native languages. Trecento is the Italian word for 1300. Basically, it's the music of the 1300s. This is a very lively piece, which is the song about spring, La Primavera. It's very dramatic if you could imagine living in a time where music was not at all a part of your life. You would go to church and you would hear a beautiful mass setting with multiple parts. At that point, it was only boys and men singing. Or to be in the town square and hear traveling musicians and see this sort of entertainment must have been really dramatic. We're so immersed in music all the time that we can't really imagine what it would be like to not have those sonorities all around us all the time. So Trecento was really kind of the beginnings of a very different style of Italian music. Meister singers were traveling musicians, were musicians in Germany, and they were mostly courtly musicians. The last one is also a French forme fixe. These coincide with poetic forms from the Middle Ages, the virelai, the ballade, and other forms, which were really kind of the beginnings of poetry and setting poetry to music. That was also a dramatic idea. Because before that point, you could substitute words in for melodies, and there wasn't a lot of thought about what's called word painting, really thinking about this word and making this word sound a certain way. Words could be substituted very freely. That's called troping. When we get to this point, the literature folks will also share these forme fixe. And these are poems that are based on very specific rhyme schemes. And this idea that one line of a rhyme, if it was repeated later in the poem, the music would be repeated too, instead of music basically being through composed. Okay, I'll just play a bit of that, because I know you're dying to get to like Mozart. Okay. This era, the preferred harmonic language were open intervals. Those kinds of sounds where the ends of a phrase would be open. In the Renaissance, there starts to be a different idea of what beautiful music sounds like. We move away from these open intervals, these sterile intervals that sound very medieval to our ears, into what are called tertian harmonies, which are harmonies based on thirds instead of fourths and fifths. So here's a fourth and a fifth. Those are very hollow. In the Renaissance, we moved toward harmonies that have thirds in them. But it takes a while to get there. Up in Burgundy, or like northern France, Dutch, and so on, there was a lot of activity going on. Here's the Renaissance. The Italian madrigal. A madrigal is a song. A madrigal is an Italian or English song from the Renaissance that is meant for a small group of choral singers, usually a few to a part. And at this time, if you didn't have a singer, you could just put an instrument on it. And that's called da cappella singing instead of a cappella, where everyone's singing, voices are singing. When you substitute an instrument in for a voice part, which was easy to do if you just have the sackbut play a part. So this is an Italian madrigal, or an Italian popular song, with racy, often songs about forbidden love, and gossipy songs about courtly characters. In this piece, you hear, I hope you can hear, very dramatic harmonies. So as I mentioned, that word painting, really thinking about the text and then providing dissonance on words like fear and death, and providing consonant intervals on ideas of springtime and love and so forth. So Italian madrigal, French chanson are sort of the same kind of idea. They're both popular kinds of songs, but the French were writing theirs and they called them chansons for the word for song, and that's this one is called Au Joli Jeu. When the text changes, there's always a new tune, and then it's imitated in other parts. And that style of music making is called imitative polyphony. Polyphony is multi-part music, where you're not all moving at the same rhythm. In church, when you sing a hymn, you're singing a homophonic texture, a melody and then harmony parts, all moving basically at the same time, same rhythm. In the Renaissance, we moved toward imitation of parts, so it sounds almost like a canon or a round, but only the beginning of each tune was the same, and it would be spread in all the parts. When the words change, it's always given a new tune. I feel like I'm boring you out of your minds, I'm so sorry. Okay. Germany. After Luther's call to end the indulgences and his theses, his demands of the church, when the church started to splinter into what is now Lutherans and Episcopalians and so forth, the Germans, one of the problems that Luther had with the church, with the Catholic Church, was the priest wasn't facing the congregation. The priest was facing away toward, basically the altar about in front. The church, the language was still in Latin, even though people in Germany had German as their main language, and none of them at this point spoke Latin. And at this point, Latin's not even a language. It had gone into all that Roman language of Latin split into the Romance languages that we know today, French, Italian, and so on. So one of the problems he had was he didn't like the chants. He didn't like being forced to sing in Latin. He didn't like that the congregation wasn't allowed to sing. The singing was the priests, and the choir were responsible for all the singing. They weren't able to understand what they were saying, so there was a lot of he had a lot of problems with the church. And so what developed was hymn singing in Germany, and that's called a choral. A choral is what we consider a modern day hymn. This is a familiar Christmas song. Can you hear? So music is starting to sound more familiar, I think, at this point. England had its own madrigals. When these madrigals, again, were for small groups of singers, 2 or 3 on a part, maybe even 1 on a part. And so these were songs in English. The English madrigal, when it ended with a fa-la-la-la-la refrain, it had a special name. It was called a ballet, like ballet, dance. The choir sang this last year. You hear that? Every choir likes singing those songs. And then the motet. A motet, which I won't play at this moment, but the motet, French for the word, for the word, motet, is an opportunity during the Mass to sing a song that's not based on the traditional Gregorian chant, but would be maybe drawn from the Bible. So it's a non-liturgical text. We call it an anthem nowadays in the US, because when the Episcopalian Church or the Anglicans wanted to perform, say, a psalm, there would be a composition, and they called that an anthem. Well, this is the equivalent of that, the Roman motet. And of course, they were part of the body of music in ancient Rome. I mean, in the Holy See. Okay, finally we're out of that era. Okay, styles. When we get to the Baroque era, this is dramatic changes. Concertato style means that there's more than one group playing antiphonally. If you go to Venice and you go to St. Mark's Cathedral, you'll actually see that there were multiple choir lofts. If you go to Bach's church in Leipzig, there were multiple choir lofts and multiple organs, and that is so that multiple ensembles could sing, and they would sing sound of body of group against group. In Venice, there were often 3 or 4 groups going at the same time, and that's called concertato or antiphonal singing. We've moved away from by the time we get to the Baroque period, we settle in on major and minor harmony. Before that, harmonies are very flexible. But now we have this idea that music has a final tone that feels finished. And that the entire piece or the entire section of the piece would stay in sort of that same key. We call that D major now, or E minor. We stay in one key where you just have a set number of 7 tones in the scale. That's very different from the Renaissance, when the tastes and the interests of the composers of that time were very different. Now by the time we get to Bach, we really settle in on what's called functional harmony. Functional harmony means that certain chords in a key are more important than others. So if I'm playing, you can already hear, you hear it in your head, right? That happened after Bach, beginning with Bach and afterwards, where you could feel like there was a progression of chords that just sounded right, and then there was a point of conclusion. That's really that's called functional harmony. Basso continuo is where you have a harpsichordist or an organist playing, improvising based on a very simple set of tablature, and then you can double that with bassoon or cello and so on. And so a lot was left up to the performers to improvise on those harmonies. If you actually listen to, if you see a live authentic production of Messiah, you will see a little tiny organ on the stage, and that person's job is to improvise and fill out harmonies. It's a very special and important skill. I'm sure, Steve, you've done a lot of that in your life. Baroque music, every text, it was very carefully considered, and then the rhythms of that text and the sounds of the rhythms, the overall color of the piece was very much influenced by dances from the Renaissance. So if you look at Baroque music and multi-work, like if you look at Messiah, each movement is really representing a different kind of dance style from the Renaissance. So, For Unto Us a Child is Born has a very different feel, and every piece is approached differently, and we can sort of trace those different kinds of vocal colors and rhythms to the Renaissance. Dramatic use of contrasts. If you look at paintings like Rembrandt, from the Renaissance, you'll see a very parallel idea of dark, 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 and light, light, light. Very dark, very light. And in music, we call that terrace dynamics. We use very loud, and then it's loud for a long time, and then it's quiet. But there's not a lot of in between moving from loud to soft. It's loud and soft. On the harpsichord, it looks like a piano with 2 keyboards. One of those keyboards would be soft and one would be loud, and they're plucked by a goose quill or some other sort of apparatus. And so you would change, and so those are representative of pieces that very much are about dramatic contrast. When it's light, it's very light. When it's dark, it's very dark. Still, the music patronage is from the church and the court. I don't see my recordings from this, but I think you all know very well things like Handel's Messiah. That's Baroque music. All right, I will move on. I don't have my little music things there. Okay, Romantic era. Yes, that is curious because I lost all these slides. Okay, so I'll just go right on. So Classical era. During the end of the 18th century is the music of Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven. Those 3 composers really dominated. That when Bach died in 1750, the era was considered over. Up to the end of the 18th century, the music of Bach and Haydn, and then Beethoven sort of sits on the bridge between classical and romantic. His later works sound very romantic, big symphonies, and his early music sounds much more like Mozart and Haydn. And the composers from that era were really reacting, these classical composers were really reacting to what they saw as excesses of the Baroque era. So if you look at the architecture of the Baroque time, for instance, Louis XIV Louis XIV's his sort of hall of mirrors, and you just look at how highly ornamented. The music really sounds very, very decorated and ornamented with long, kind of unreasonable, inhuman melody lines. Well, because we are moving away from patronage only from the church or only from the court, we now have a third patronage at this point, and this happens at the same time as the Enlightenment, when the individual begins to be empowered. We have the merchant middle class who are willing to now pay for tickets. So the music is no longer to the purview of what the bishop wants in your diocese or what the king likes to hear, what Louis XIV, that music that he liked and what he commissioned sounds very much like those ornamented things. So to appeal to the middle class or to the popular tastes, composers started doing things like spreading out. If you, with Bach, you would have a chord change very quickly. Something's always moving. With Mozart and Haydn, he slowed down how long you would stay on a chord, which is what we do to this day. So we'd have now, and the way you get away with holding that chord long time is by separating the notes in the chord, and then before you don't even realize you're holding one chord for 4 beats, versus Bach, who would change often on the 8th note, almost every single note. Okay, so the classicists of Mozart, they got the middle class money. They started writing music that anybody would want to hear, and these composers started writing. Haydn wrote 100 symphonies because he just churn out these symphonies. Town squares would perform them, and so on. But this move away, this beginning of musical phrases that are equal. The Baroque music, if you hear, "For unto us a child is born," it's inhuman. Nobody can really do it, but we pull it off, right? So that's not appealing to the middle class ear. What is appealing are songs that sound like folk songs. And they're melodies that are memorable. When you leave the symphony, you can hear the melody in your head. That's what this appealed to middle class. Now, these were geniuses doing this, but they were able to pull off this really high art of music that was also appealing to regular folks like me. Okay, so moving into the Romantic era. Classicism is objective versus the Romantic era, which moved to the subjective. Classicists are interested in tradition and order, and the Romantics were interested in expressing themselves from their inner drives, their inner interests. And this is the beginning of the time. The Romantic era is when the first time when composers can be freelance. Even Haydn, living in the palace in Vienna, was considered the hired help. So Mozart couldn't bear that thought, so he was a pauper his whole life, or much of his adult life. Classicists are more aristocratic. Romantics are more interested in equality and democracy. Classicists are restrained in their music versus the Romantics are emotional, and classicists are interested in realism, romanticism, supernaturalism. So this is where music is going, to this very, very individual composer really representing his or her own ideas. Okay, so they were out of order, okay. All right, so I think I covered all of that. So let me just play a little bit of, I also want to say with Mozart and Haydn, the harpsichord goes away. It sounds old-fashioned, and we have the beginning of the use of the piano for the first time. Bach only heard his own music on the piano once, and he didn't like it. So his music was really written for the organ and for the harpsichord, or what was called eventually the pianoforte. Then the piano evolved until what we really know, and by the time Liszt and other composers, Chopin and performers, by the 19th century, we really have what we call the modern piano. So the harpsichord and the organ are going to be taken out of the orchestra, but we have new instruments and the expanded use. So this is when we get the clarinet and other instruments. So I want to play you a little bit of a Haydn choral piece. That's Beethoven, sorry. Let me go back to here. that's Mozart. I'm going to move on. Okay. This is sadly, this is the music people they only want to pay for Mozart and Beethoven. So it's been hard for a lot of composers for beginning in the 19th century to to get people to want to play their music. We have Rachmaninoff and so forth, but modern audiences only want to hear the classical and the Romantic period. So I'm going to go to there now. Okay, mood. By the Romantic era, we've moved away from this restraint and balance of the classical composers, Mozart, Haydn, and now we're back into this dramatic the inner world, the psyche, and so what becomes the interest of the Romantics. Let me play just some examples. Elegant pieces meant for the salon, the living room. Dramatic changes in tempo. Very elegant. Here's another example. Long, expressive melodies, very chromatic. Chromaticism is when you borrow more tones from the entire scale. The chromatic means color, and there are 12 possible tones within an octave till we repeat. We're used to hearing only 7 of those. We're skipping over 5 of them. When we get to the Romantic era, all 12 notes are going to become very, very important because it gives the composers even more colors to work with to really demonstrate and paint the texts. It was also an era of celebrating national and international kind of sounds. So gypsies, a lot of people say it's derogatory now, but they were called gypsy songs by Brahms. Here's an example of that. This comes from his love songs. They sound like gypsies, the flavor. Okay, now we're going on to the 20th century now. The 20th century is complex. The bridge between Romantic and 20th century really happens with the Impressionists. If you look at the Monet paintings, those hazy, ethereal, colors that when you look very close, they're just patches of color, but when you step back, you see this entire image as one, often depicting things like of water and of countrysides, and they give you this feeling of fluidity and atmosphere. That was happening in music as well. In poetry, it was called the symbolists were doing that. In music, we call it Impressionism, and Debussy really was the master of that. And here's an example of this. It sounds very much about atmosphere. Nothing angular, nothing harsh and disruptive, nothing extreme. It's very much an atmosphere in the entire piece. That was Impressionism. Just like the Monet paintings are giving an impression, it's very much in parallel. Once we get to the World Wars, then everything in music is going to change. The rules are no longer valid. Bach's music, Haydn, Mozart, those composers just don't encapsulate for the modern era the stormy, unpredictable lives of the 20th century. And so we move into the modern era of the arts. This is a time when people were questioning what art was. You'll hear in music in the modern era dissonance. Dissonance is when tones cluster versus consonance, where they have a more consonant or pleasing sonority. So how do you communicate World War? Well, you communicate that through dissonance. And so the Western major and minor harmonies are going to be thrown away by a lot of composers. And so this is an example. This is the Dies Irae from Benjamin Britten's Requiem. That's modern, okay? Now, because we always swing pendulum, we had our classical composers, literally classical as Mozart and Haydn. Then we went to the Romantic era. We didn't like the squared off, even phrases, singable tunes. The Romantics went inward. I don't care if people buy my music. I'm going to write what I want to write. I'm going to express myself. Then that's going to get old. And then composers in the 20th century started to long for the limited means, or an economy of means. Let's make the orchestra doesn't have to be 100 people like it was by the end of the 19th century. Let's make it 9. In fact, let's take all the violins out, just because that would even be more. So these self-imposed limits are what we call neoclassical composers. And it's very emotionally restrained, what you might consider stoic in sound. I'll just play you a little bit of that. This is a piece by Stravinsky, his Our Father who art in heaven, Pater Noster. Just lacking in dramatic emotion. Hear that? Just, it's almost cold. Another trend was exoticism. Not in the 19th century, composers were interested in representing the gypsies, but they may never have gone and met a gypsy. In the 20th century, we really have an era where we begin to be interested in other cultures and really trying to retain as much of that culture and infuse it into the music here. And that's called exoticism or primitivism. And you hear that in music like this. Every movie trailer is using this piece. It's evoking very base, human, instinctual, primitive desires. It's like scary. And then finally, this is where I'll stop and then take your comments and questions, if you'll still have me, is folk traditionalism. The 20th century also saw a time when composers were interested in their own music, but in an authentic way. So composers in England and Hungary, for instance, would go out to the countryside. Now we have recording equipment. They would record these songs, and then they would arrange those or infuse those songs right into their music. So the English composers Vaughan Williams and Gustav Holst, for example, really, this song was collected from the countryside and then it was arranged into this beautiful. It's really trying to lift the folk song up to a really high artistic level. With that folk traditionalism came a rebirth, a reinterest in those modes, those scales from the Renaissance. Remember that when we got to the Baroque period, we settled in major and minor. Major is, that's a major scale. All of the notes from that piece would be in those scale. Minor, we're already used to hearing those chords. In the Renaissance and then renewed interest in the 20th century were these 5 other scales, and there's even more. But this was one. So this one sounds like minor so far, but then it's just a little bit different than minor. And that piece that you heard is actually from what's called a mode, or another kind of scale. So I hope that you've been able to make some connections that way back in antiquity and then into the Middle Ages when we just had unison singing, that step by step, generation by generation, era by era, we've expanded, and now we're sort of like, we don't know where we're going next. There's some lots of ideas about where choral music is going, but I hope that you've had at least a tiny bit of insight into what you're hearing when you go to a concert. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And in my haste to get to the presentation, I forgot to introduce that you are Associate Professor of Music and Director of the choral programs at the college. So thank you for including that bit about something the choir did. So if any of you have questions, either about what's been presented or about what's going on with the choir, I'll be happy to bring a microphone to you.
You have this material organized. Do you offer this in a course? And if so, what do you call the course?
This would be a course called Choral Literature, and you would go through basically 100 years a week in that. Yeah, we want to add that class when we get to our revised music education curriculum, which we're doing now. And one of the classes we feel that the students have been deficient in their really going deeply into, we've done a good job at the college of giving a broad and balanced education, but in terms of going deeper, really like understanding the literature of the music and how it unfolds outside of just a really quick survey of Western music all put together. This is the kind of class that you would take, and every grad student would definitely take this, but this was like a lot in 45 minutes. Yeah.
When you come back in 1,000 years, what is the next 1,000 going to look like?
That is a good question. So it sort of, I think, depends on where we are now, which, I mean, so the modernists were those responding to the World War, this new time of, and then we've moved, so the modernists were really questioning, what is music? Can music just be sitting and listening to sounds? Like really what it's like, is a urinal sitting against a wall art? The visual artists were questioning, what is art? That's what modernists were really doing. The postmodernists, which is where we are moving into, are not only interested in challenging the status quo and what are the musical materials that actually make music up, but really moving past any form of narrative at all. So we're kind of moving past this idea that music every word has to be communicated through musical means or through artistic means. And so that's kind of one strand that's going on now. Another is a renewed interest in spirituality and spiritual music. So you hear a lot of chords that the ones choirs love to sing are songs that sound like this, like, see those very, very ethereal, almost neo-impressionist. That's kind of what choirs are wanting to sing right now. I'm hoping that music stays because it's just so beautiful. That's the kind of music I like to write too, just really close harmonies. But we won't know until 3 or 4 generations when they get to decide what our superb music is and what gets to be kept and performed. That's not our job. We don't get to know that, but I hope it's the spiritual music. That's what I like singing in church and playing in church. But also an interest in world cultures too. No choir would just do white Western music anymore. Every choir nowadays is going to make sure there's an African song and an Asian song represented. So this multiculturalism is really part of, instead of just doing major works by Mozart, we now think of Mozart as part of a larger picture, and broad and balanced is our goal. Yeah.
I was just thinking that with the electronic influences and the way they distort the tones, whether we'll be hearing a lot more quarter tones stuck in there and other kinds of stuff that for the traditionalists and some of us that have been around a while kind of turn us off, and I know which commercials I turn off and which ones I'm willing to listen to because of the sounds. But anyway, I think that's certainly going to affect what we hear and can accept, I'd imagine. Just guessing.
Yeah, like if you listen to the ragas of India, they have those sounds that are in between the white and black keys on the piano, and those don't sound dissonant to them, but to our Western ears, we're really used to a 12-tone system.
Could you tell us a little bit about what's happening at the college What are
In the music program?
in the particularly choral? What groups? What are they doing? Where are they going?
Sure. We are, this is my second year. When I came to the choir, there were about 15 in the choir. That was way down from 6 years before that when Steve was the conductor. And I'm living in this very big shadow right now of that. Like, when are you going to get more singers? I know. That's what I always hear. So the choir is up to 17. So we had like 8 people graduate and leave, and then I was able to recruit 10. So I was really proud of that, because at least and I figured if I can get 10 people in a year, then maybe, and they all want to stay. We are, the McPherson College Choir is still the touring choir. We were planning to go to Jamaica this year, but students nowadays are, for a variety of reasons, it's very difficult for them to raise money, and it's hard to travel. So we are rethinking how we're going to do that. We had planned in January to do a work trip / music tour, where during the day in Jamaica we would go to a community and build a house, deliver some school supplies, and then do a concert. So it was going to be a joint effort, and it is going to happen, but we're going to give ourselves 2 years to raise the money and like really help the students go. Just letting them do it on their own just didn't work. So that's coming. We have a couple of choirs. I have a small men's choir. They're called the Singing Statesmen. And they love, there's 5 or 6 in there. And then the women form the small women's choir called the Bel Canto, or Beautiful Singing, Bel Canto singers. Over 4 years before I got there, we only had 1 music major, 2, actually, really just 2. And so when I got here last year, we had 1. And now this year we have 4 or 5 that have come in. So our recruiting efforts are actually paying off. I know that sounds like very few, but that's a 400% increase from my first year. As you can imagine, recruiting is very difficult because there's so many colleges even just within 20 minutes of here. So we're working on that. But the biggest thing that we're doing that's very exciting is we are the plan for sustainability really merged music and theater into one department for a number of reasons, many that you probably already know about, long before I got here. The plan for sustainability solved a lot of problems. It created some problems. But last year we really talked about it, and we realized the problems it solved are no longer problems. We're ready to go back into a music and theater department as separate departments. Same hallway, best friends still, not leaving. But we're developing our own curricula this year that really calls upon what Steve and his generation of musicians did, and then also looking at what 21st century music teachers are looking at. So we're developing a BA in music, which is a broad liberal arts music program, and then the BA in music education, which will then add certification classes and a student teaching experience. That's what we want to go back. Kyle and I feel our main focus right now is recruiting for our ensembles. That's our first priority. We want to get our choir big and sounding wonderful like it used to. And of course, Kyle's been a miracle worker. He had like 3 people his first year, like 6 years ago, and now it's like 500 or whatever, So I have another very big shout out right there, and he just makes it look so easy. It's like, oh, all you do is recruit 24 hours a day. It's no big deal. So good things are happening. It's really exciting. I'm really excited about our program review so that we can develop a program that's, for instance, we're adding a course. It's going to be a course in world music. So there'll be a non-Western musical traditions, which is a huge passion of mine. And so lots of things.
And people will be able to hear the choir at homecoming.
Right. So homecoming Sunday at 2 p.m. So if you go to the Brethren Church, you're going to go for lunch, and then you're going to come back at 2. And that's why I did that, so that people, because once it's 5 o'clock, you just don't want to do anything. You want to go home, right? So it's a 2 o'clock concert to make it convenient for you. And to come and join us. And we're going to be singing songs representing many style periods, including some of those periods that you heard today. But then also, again, augmenting with non-Western music. We have some South African freedom songs that we're singing. We have a student in there from the Republic of Congo. And I'm looking forward to this year finding what his music sounds like. He's a superb musician, just a natural singer and piano player, just very much self-taught and a superb student. So you're going to hear a lot of different textures. I do also want to invite you to, I think it's the first Sunday in December. Last year I started this Festival of Readings and Carols. So this is a really nice Christmas service that feels very different than the traditional just town and gown, stand up and then sing your songs and then leave. These will be readings and poems that will be interspersed with carols and Christmas tunes, and so it's a very, very, and candlelight and so on. That's a really, I think, a nice tradition. I hope you'll join us for that too. First Sunday in December, same time.
Well,
same place.
Let's join together in thanking James again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And next month, come back to hear Kenyon present.